My name is Ellen Mercer, and in October of 2018, I was 52 years old, newly divorced, and convinced that the worst thing waiting for me in northern Maine was an awkward Thanksgiving dinner with my older sister. I was wrong. My sister, Diane, lived outside a town called Bellwether, a place so small that the welcome sign had been repainted 3 times but the population number had never changed. The town sat between black spruce forest and low granite hills, 2 hours from the nearest airport and 20 minutes from the nearest reliable cell signal. Diane had moved there after marrying a local carpenter. She loved the quiet. I found it oppressive. I had driven up from Massachusetts in a rented SUV because flying with 2 anxious dogs had seemed impossible. By the time I crossed into Maine, rain had turned to sleet. The sky looked bruised, and every few miles another station disappeared from the radio until only static remained. Diane had warned me not to trust the navigation app near Bellwether. She said logging roads were constantly being renamed or closed. She gave me written directions and underlined one sentence twice. Do not take Widow's Road after dark. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Naturally, Widow's Road was exactly where my phone told me to turn. At first, I did not realize the mistake. The road was paved, narrow, and lined with pines. Then the pavement became cracked tar. The tar became gravel. 10 minutes later, the gravel narrowed into 2 muddy tracks with weeds growing between them. I stopped and checked Diane's directions. The beam from the dome light made the windows around me look like mirrors. Beyond them, the forest was completely black. I should have turned around, but the map showed that Widow's Road reconnected with the county highway 6 miles ahead, and I was already exhausted. My dogs, Lucy and Max, were restless in the back seat. I told myself that Diane's warning was probably about snowdrifts or washed-out bridges. Then I heard the crying. It came from somewhere ahead and to the right. A child, maybe 6 or 7, sobbing hard enough to gasp between breaths. Before the danger became impossible to deny, there was another detail connected to the first miles after leaving the interstate that remained with the narrator. Nothing moved naturally. Even familiar objects appeared staged, as though someone had arranged them for an audience. Fear did not arrive as panic. It arrived as a quiet disagreement between what the eyes reported and what the mind was willing to accept. The narrator recorded the detail mentally without understanding why. It would return later, sharper and more threatening, when escape was no longer simple. In concrete terms, abandoned mailboxes leaned toward the road and handmade wooden crosses appeared at bends. The implication was worse. Diane had told Ellen that locals marked fatal accidents with flowers, but these crosses had no names. Both dogs became silent. I lowered my window an inch. Cold air knifed into the car, carrying the smell of wet bark and something metallic. The crying came again. "Help me!" The voice was small, frightened, and unmistakably close. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. Even now, that decision embarrasses me. I had spent 29 years working as a school counselor. Every instinct I had was trained toward a child in distress. I knew remote places could be dangerous. I knew people used recordings to lure victims. But I also knew that if a real child was lost in those woods and I drove away, I would never forgive myself. The beam of my flashlight reached only a few yards between the trunks. The sleet had softened into cold rain. Mud sucked at my shoes. "Hello?" I called. "My name is Ellen. I'm here to help." The crying stopped. For several seconds there was no sound except rain ticking against dead leaves. Then a pale face appeared between 2 trees. It belonged to a little girl wearing a red coat. Her hair hung wet against her cheeks. She stood barefoot in the mud, staring at me without blinking. Years later, the narrator would return most often to Ellen's last phone call with Diane, because that was where the ordinary world first began to come apart. The light flattened every surface and made distance difficult to judge. The detail became important because it suggested preparation. Whatever controlled the place was not reacting to visitors. It was expecting them. The narrator paused, listened, and considered turning back. Then a smaller, more reasonable concern pushed the decision forward. Weather, embarrassment, family, money, or the belief that help must be close. What could be observed was simple. Diane became unusually stern when Widow's Road was mentioned. What it suggested was far more disturbing. She made Ellen repeat the correct route aloud, as though memorizing an emergency procedure. Sweetheart, are you hurt? There is a particular kind of fear that belongs only to isolated places. In a city, danger is surrounded by witnesses, traffic, light, and the promise that somebody might hear you. On a back road, fear has room to breathe. It can stand in the middle of the lane and wait. It can follow at the same speed for miles. It can borrow the voice of someone you trust because there is no one nearby to tell you that the voice is wrong. She shook her head. Where are your parents? The girl lifted one hand and pointed deeper into the forest. I asked her to come to the car, but she stepped backward. I moved closer. She backed away again, always keeping the same distance between us. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The second was the dogs. Lucy and Max had begun throwing themselves against the rear windows. They were not barking at the girl. They were barking past her, towards something I could not see. I turned my flashlight in that direction. At first there was only rain and trees. Then the beam caught a strip of white cloth tied around a trunk. Another strip hung from the next tree, and another beyond it, forming a path. The girl whispered, "Mama can't find the road." The official version rarely mentioned the moment the dogs sensed the forest, but it became one of the most important pieces of the story. A faint smell of wet wood, old fabric, and cold metal clung to the scene. At the time, it was easy to place the detail inside a practical explanation. Later, once the full pattern became visible, the explanation felt less like reason and more like permission to keep moving toward danger. No one nearby offered a direct warning. Instead, people watched for a reaction, as though they were measuring whether the newcomer had noticed too much. The visible clue was that both animals stopped panting and stared at the same dark gap between the trees. Beneath it lay the possibility that their synchronized fear made the crying child feel less like a stranded traveler and more like bait. "What is your name?" "Annie." "Annie, come with me. We'll call the police." Her expression changed. It was not anger exactly. It was disappointment. "You promised." "I didn't promise anything. You always promise." A branch snapped behind me. I spun around. There was no one there, but my car's headlights had gone out. The engine was still running. The dashboard glowed faintly through the windshield, yet the road itself had vanished into darkness. When I looked back, Annie was farther away. She stood beside a wooden sign half hidden by brush. I had not noticed it before. The paint had peeled away, but I could make out 2 words carved into the plank. What happened around the white cloth path did not seem terrifying at first. That was precisely why it mattered. The air seemed unusually still, carrying small sounds farther than they should have traveled. That moment also revealed how communities protect secrets, not always through direct lies, but through shrugs, jokes, and the suggestion that asking another question would be impolite. A question was asked and answered too quickly. The conversation moved on, but the answer did not feel complete. In concrete terms, some strips were fresh cotton, while others were yellowed and brittle. The implication was worse. The trail had been renewed by different hands across many decades. "Mercy Camp." The girl turned and walked into the woods. I did not follow. I ran to the SUV, slammed the door, and locked it. Both dogs climbed into the front seat, trembling so hard their tags rattled. I put the vehicle in reverse. Looking back, the warning signs were never hidden. They were simply ordinary enough to ignore. A local person changing the subject, an old sign turned away from the highway, a road that appeared newer on the map than it looked beneath the tires. We expect danger to announce itself dramatically. More often, it arrives disguised as inconvenience, coincidence, or the feeling that we are being foolish for wanting to turn back. The rear camera showed a woman standing behind the car. She wore a long gray dress. Her head was bowed, and wet hair covered her face. One hand rested on the back window. I twisted around. No one was there. On the camera, the woman lifted her face. Her mouth was open much wider than a human mouth should open. I screamed and hit the accelerator. Before the danger became impossible to deny, there was another detail connected to the inside of Jonah's cabin that remained with the narrator. Nothing moved naturally. Even familiar objects appeared staged, as though someone had arranged them for an audience. Fear did not arrive as panic. It arrived as a quiet disagreement between what the eyes reported and what the mind was willing to accept. The narrator recorded the detail mentally without understanding why. It would return later, sharper and more threatening, when escape was no longer simple. What could be observed was simple. Shelves held notebooks labeled with dates, weather, voices heard, and names spoken outside. What it suggested was far more disturbing. Jonah had spent years documenting the pattern and knew Ellen's family name before she arrived. The SUV lurched backward. Something struck the roof with a heavy thud. Fingers scraped across the metal. I kept driving in reverse until the tires slid into the ditch and the vehicle slammed to a stop. The engine died. The crying started again, but this time it came from every direction. Lucy crawled into my lap. Max pressed himself beneath the dashboard. I tried my phone. No service. I tried restarting the engine. Nothing. Then someone knocked on the driver's window. 3 slow taps. A man stood outside holding an old-fashioned lantern. He was in his 70s, broad-shouldered, with a white beard and a wool cap. A hunting rifle hung from one shoulder. I nearly drove my elbow through the opposite window trying to get away from him. He raised both hands. "Ma'am, you need to get out of this car." I shook my head. He looked toward the trees. "They've seen you now." That sentence scared me more than the rifle. Years later, the narrator would return most often to Jonah's connection to Diane, because that was where the ordinary world first began to come apart. The light flattened every surface and made distance difficult to judge. The detail became important because it suggested preparation. Whatever controlled the place was not reacting to visitors. It was expecting them. The narrator paused, listened, and considered turning back. Then a smaller, more reasonable concern pushed the decision forward. Weather, embarrassment, family, money, or the belief that help must be close. The visible clue was that an old photograph showed Diane as a teenager standing near Mercy Camp with several friends. Beneath it lay the possibility that one face had been scratched away so violently that the paper was torn. He introduced himself as Jonah Pike and said his cabin was less than a quarter-mile away. He told me the road flooded near the county line and that my SUV would never make it through the mud. When I asked who they were, he refused to answer. "Bring the dogs," he said. "Leave your lights off." I should not have trusted him, yet the crying had moved closer, and small handprints were appearing one after another on the outside of the windshield. I grabbed the dogs and followed Jonah. He moved quickly for an older man, keeping the lantern covered beneath his coat. We left the road and climbed a slope through thick brush. Behind us, the crying changed into laughter. Jonah's cabin had no electricity. The windows were boarded from inside, and bundles of dried herbs hung over every door. He pushed a heavy dresser against the entrance after we entered. People who grow up in small towns learn 2 histories. One is printed in anniversary books and displayed in framed photographs at the library. The other is passed quietly across kitchen tables after children have gone to bed. The second history contains the names no one says in public, the houses no one buys, and the stretches of road where even lifelong residents refuse to stop. Only then did he explain. Mercy Camp had been a tuberculosis retreat in the 1920s. Wealthy families sent sick children there, believing the clean forest air would save them. During the winter of 1927, the camp's doctor abandoned the property after supplies stopped arriving. 31 children and 4 nurses were left behind. The official record said they died from illness and exposure. Jonah said the official record lied. A search party found the camp in spring. The cabins were empty. No bodies, no clothing, no bedding. Only hundreds of strips of white cloth tied to trees, leading in circles around the property. The official version rarely mentioned the hospital ward vision, but it became one of the most important pieces of the story. A faint smell of wet wood, old fabric, and cold metal clung to the scene. At the time, it was easy to place the detail inside a practical explanation. Later, once the full pattern became visible, the explanation felt less like reason and more like permission to keep moving toward danger. No one nearby offered a direct warning. Instead, people watched for a reaction, as though they were measuring whether the newcomer had noticed too much. In concrete terms, several children held objects taken from modern visitors: a car key, a watch, a pink phone case. The implication was worse. The ward was not frozen in 1927, but had been collecting people and belongings ever since. Decades later, hunters began reporting a little girl in a red coat asking for help. Those who followed her disappeared. Some returned days later unable to speak. Others were found barefoot on Widow's Road, facing the forest, their feet black with frostbite even in summer. "Why hasn't anyone closed the road?" I asked. "They do," Jonah said. "It opens itself." I thought he was joking. His face told me he was not. At midnight, something walked around the cabin. The floorboards vibrated beneath slow footsteps. The dogs tracked the sound from wall to wall. A woman began humming outside, soft and tuneless. Jonah put one finger to his lips. The humming stopped beside the window. A child's voice said, "Ellen?" I felt every hair rise on my arms. "Your mother is cold." My mother had died 12 years earlier. What happened around Ellen's escape through the trees did not seem terrifying at first. That was precisely why it mattered. The air seemed unusually still, carrying small sounds farther than they should have traveled. That moment also revealed how communities protect secrets, not always through direct lies, but through shrugs, jokes, and the suggestion that asking another question would be impolite. A question was asked and answered too quickly. The conversation moved on, but the answer did not feel complete. What could be observed was simple. The dogs repeatedly changed direction, seconds before pale figures crossed the path. What it suggested was far more disturbing. The animals seemed able to see openings in the forest that Ellen could not. The voice moved to the front door. "She wants you to come outside." I covered my mouth. Then came my mother's voice, perfect in every detail. "Ellie, honey, open the door." The last time she had called me Ellie, I had been holding her hand in hospice. I stood before I realized I was moving. Jonah grabbed my wrist so hard it hurt. "That is not your mother." Outside, my mother began to cry. The mind protects itself by searching for practical explanations. Exhaustion, weather, reflections, an animal moving through brush, a damaged radio. That instinct is useful, but it can also become a trap. Sometimes we keep explaining a thing long after the explanation has stopped making sense, because accepting the alternative would require us to admit that the world is larger, older, and less interested in our safety than we believed. For almost an hour, the thing moved around the cabin using voices from my life. My ex-husband apologized. My father begged me to help him. One of my former students said she was lost. Each voice knew exactly what guilt to press. Then the voice of my sister Diane came from behind the cabin. Before the danger became impossible to deny, there was another detail connected to the sheriff's reaction that remained with the narrator. Nothing moved naturally. Even familiar objects appeared staged, as though someone had arranged them for an audience. Fear did not arrive as panic. It arrived as a quiet disagreement between what the eyes reported and what the mind was willing to accept. The narrator recorded the detail mentally without understanding why. It would return later, sharper and more threatening, when escape was no longer simple. The visible clue was that he avoided writing Jonah's name and asked whether Ellen had heard any family voices. Beneath it lay the possibility that his questions sounded rehearsed, suggesting the department had handled similar survivors. "Ellen, don't listen to him. Jonah killed those children." Jonah closed his eyes. I looked at him. "How does it know your name?" He said nothing. The boards over the rear window shuddered. Nails squealed as something pulled from outside. Jonah loaded his rifle. "Tell me the truth," I demanded. He whispered, "My grandfather was the camp doctor." The room seemed to tilt. According to Jonah, Dr. Pike had not abandoned the children. He had tried to save them after the nurses began behaving strangely. The children claimed a woman was calling them into the forest at night. Soon the nurses heard her too. When supplies ran low, panic spread. Dr. Pike tied white cloth between the cabins so no one would become lost during storms. But every morning the cloth had been moved, forming paths into the woods. One night, all 31 children walked out together. Years later, the narrator would return most often to Diane's confession, because that was where the ordinary world first began to come apart. The light flattened every surface and made distance difficult to judge. The detail became important because it suggested preparation. Whatever controlled the place was not reacting to visitors. It was expecting them. The narrator paused, listened, and considered turning back. Then a smaller, more reasonable concern pushed the decision forward. Weather, embarrassment, family, money, or the belief that help must be close. In concrete terms, she admitted that as teenagers, she and friends dared one another to follow the red-coated girl. The implication was worse. One boy vanished and the survivors agreed to blame Jonah. The nurses followed. Dr. Pike went after them and found the children standing around an old sinkhole. Something below was speaking in their voices. He tried to pull them away. They turned on him. Jonah said his grandfather escaped, but not before shooting one of the nurses. The town protected him because people feared what the full story would do to Bellwether. Mercy Camp was erased from maps. Widow's Road was rerouted, but the forest kept returning what it had taken. The boards tore free from the rear window. A woman's pale arm reached through. Jonah fired. The muzzle flash filled the cabin. The arm vanished, but the window opened onto something impossible. Instead of forest, I saw a long hospital ward illuminated by oil lamps. Rows of narrow beds stretched into darkness. Children sat upright beneath white sheets, all staring at me. Annie stood at the end of the ward. Grief makes a person vulnerable in ways that are difficult to describe. It is not merely sadness. It is an unfinished conversation that follows you from room to room. It is the reflex to turn when you hear a familiar laugh in a grocery store. Any horror intelligent enough to understand grief would never need claws. It would need only the right face and the patience to wait outside the door. The official version rarely mentioned the recovered video, but it became one of the most important pieces of the story. A faint smell of wet wood, old fabric, and cold metal clung to the scene. At the time, it was easy to place the detail inside a practical explanation. Later, once the full pattern became visible, the explanation felt less like reason and more like permission to keep moving toward danger. No one nearby offered a direct warning. Instead, people watched for a reaction, as though they were measuring whether the newcomer had noticed too much. What could be observed was simple. Audio specialists isolated 31 children whispering different versions of Ellen's name. What it suggested was far more disturbing. Beneath them, a man repeatedly warned her not to look behind. "Ellen," she said, "we need a counselor." The children smiled. Jonah poured kerosene beneath the window and struck a match. Flames climbed the wall. He shouted for me to take the dogs and run. "You're coming with us." He looked toward the hospital ward. "I was born here. It knows I belong to it." Before I could stop him, he pushed me through the front door and slammed it behind me. The forest erupted with voices. I ran without knowing where I was going. The dogs pulled me downhill. Behind us, the cabin burned, orange light flashing between the trees. Figures moved around it, children in white gowns, women in gray dresses, and something taller than the flames. The thing lifted Jonah from the doorway. For 1 second I saw him suspended above the ground, kicking and fighting. Then every light went out. At dawn, a logging truck found me walking along the county highway with both dogs. The driver called the sheriff. Deputies searched for my SUV and for Jonah's cabin. What happened around the yearly cloth did not seem terrifying at first. That was precisely why it mattered. The air seemed unusually still, carrying small sounds farther than they should have traveled. That moment also revealed how communities protect secrets, not always through direct lies, but through shrugs, jokes, and the suggestion that asking another question would be impolite. A question was asked and answered too quickly. The conversation moved on, but the answer did not feel complete. The visible clue was that security cameras never capture who ties it and tracks in the snow begin at the tree itself. Beneath it lay the possibility that the message is less a threat than proof that Mercy Camp has learned where Ellen lives. They found the SUV. They did not find the cabin. Diane arrived at the sheriff's office white with fear. When I told her about Jonah Pike, she stared at me for a long time. Then she said Jonah had died in 1994. He had been found barefoot on Widow's Road, facing the forest. I left Bellwether the next morning. A month later, the rental company called about damage to the SUV. They said the roof was covered in shallow dents shaped like small bare feet. The rear camera had also recorded 43 minutes of corrupted video. The technician recovered one still image. It showed me standing outside the vehicle with my flashlight. Behind me were 31 children, and at the edge of the frame, holding an old lantern, stood Jonah Pike. I still do not know whether he saved me that night or led me exactly where the forest wanted me to go. In the weeks after Ellen returned home, she began searching public records for Mercy Camp. The state archive contained only 2 references: a land purchase in 1923 and a tax seizure in 1931. Both documents listed different owners, and neither mentioned children. A retired surveyor eventually mailed her a hand-drawn map showing 6 buildings near the sinkhole Jonah had described. Across the margin, someone had written, "Do not mark this on the county copy." The handwriting matched a note in Diane's high school yearbook. That discovery forced Ellen to understand that the silence around Mercy Camp was not accidental or ancient. It had been renewed by every generation that inherited the fear. Ellen also contacted former residents who had left Bellwether. Their stories varied in detail but shared the same structure. A voice called from the trees. A familiar person appeared where no person should be. Someone followed, and the town later explained the disappearance as exposure, running away, or an accident near the lake. One woman remembered her father nailing shut the back door every October. Another said her family moved after her younger brother began setting places at dinner for children only he could see. None of them wanted their names used. Even far from Bellwether, they still believed the forest listened when Mercy Camp was discussed. The final confirmation came from Diane herself. Months after their confrontation, she sent Ellen a package containing the scratched photograph from Jonah's cabin. On the back were the names of 7 teenagers. Beside 3 names was the word returned. Beside 2 was never found. Beside Diane's name was a single sentence. She heard her mother. Ellen understood then why Diane had tried so hard to keep her away from Widow's Road. It was not only fear that Ellen would be harmed, it was fear that the forest would recognize the family again and finish a conversation that had begun decades before. But every October, on the first night of sleet, someone leaves a strip of white cloth tied to the tree outside my house. And from the woods beyond my backyard, a little girl cries until morning. Some roads frighten us because they are empty. Widow's Road was worse because it never felt empty at all. Even after Ellen escaped, the story left one question hanging over every later account. How many people had heard a familiar voice in those woods, turned toward it, and never understood that the forest had already learned their name? Bellwether's silence did not protect outsiders. It protected the town from having to admit how many warnings had been ignored. Don't forget to let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.